He saved a young widow and her son from the fire, but that night, something far more dangerous began to burn inside him. Eli Ward came to Ash Hollow to protect the town, not to feel again. A widowed gunman with a past soaked in guilt, he took the sheriff's badge hoping to silence the ghosts that kept him awake. But when the Dawson Gang set the grain mill ablaze, and he found Clara Finch clutching her little boy beneath the collapsing roof, his mission turned personal. He carried them out through the smoke, his arms scorched, his heart trembling, and for the first time in years, he cared if someone lived. Since that night, Eli's watch has changed. Every shadow could hide an outlaw or his own weakness. Protecting her means facing what he buried with his wife's grave, the fear of loving again, of failing again. Clara sees the gentleness behind his silence, and the town begins to see a man worth following. But every act of kindness ties him closer to her, and closer to danger. When the Dawson Gang returns with revenge in their eyes, they take aim not at the town but at Clara and her son. Eli readies his last bullet, torn between duty and heart. If he saves them, he could lose everything. But if he doesn't, what kind of man would he be? Ash Hollow wasn't much of a town, just a cluster of wooden buildings fading beneath the Wyoming Sunday. The wind never stopped howling there, carrying with it the whispers of people too stubborn or too poor to leave. The saloon's sign swung half-broken, the church bell rusted silent, and every window carried the same reflection: fear. Eli Ward arrived with a single horse and a badge that barely gleamed. His small cabin sat on the edge of town, facing the endless plains, a place as empty as the man who slept inside it. Each dawn, he rode the dusty streets, boots echoing against silence, checking doors, watching over people who wouldn't meet his eyes. He didn't blame them. Men who carried death in their past rarely carried comfort in their presence. Only one house felt alive, the Finch home. A crooked porch, a single lantern at dusk, and the faint laughter of a child. Clara Finch had turned that tiny cabin into a world of warmth, mending torn clothes, baking bread to sell, whispering prayers that smelled of hope. From his window, Eli sometimes saw her through the curtain light her hair loose, her boy sleeping against her arm. In a place where everything was falling apart, that small flicker of light made him remember what peace used to feel like, and why it terrified him. The storm came without warning, a low growl rolling across the plains before the sky split open. By dusk, thunder shook the windows of Ash Hollow, and the wind carried something worse than rain, the sound of hooves. Eli stepped out of the saloon as lightning carved through the dark. At the far end of Main Street, 5 riders appeared, shadows against the firelight. The Dawson Gang had returned, faces wrapped, guns glinting. They weren't here to steal. They were here to finish what they'd started. Shots rang out, windows shattered. Eli dove behind a wagon, his revolver barking back into the storm. Then he heard a cry from across the street. Clara. She was clutching her boy behind a rain barrel, the child screaming as bullets tore through the mud around them. Without thinking, Eli ran. One outlaw took aim. Eli's shot dropped him before the thunder could echo. He grabbed Clara, pulled her toward the alley, shielding her with his coat. The boy trembled in her arms, and for a heartbeat, Eli forgot the gunfire. All he saw was the reflection of his own loss staring back at him. When the gang fled into the night, the town lay broken and smoking. Clara's hands shook as she pressed a cloth against Eli's bleeding arm. He winced, but didn't pull away. For the first time since his wife's death, someone was close enough to make him feel alive, and that scared him more than any outlaw ever could. The town buried 2 men the next morning. No one spoke during the service, not even the preacher. Dust rose from the graves and hung in the air like a warning. Eli stood apart from the others, hat in hand, jaw clenched. He'd killed 3 men the night before, and somehow it still hadn't felt like victory. Clara stood beside her son, quiet and pale, her eyes darting toward him once, then down again. That night, Sheriff Eli Ward became more than just a name on a badge. He rode from door to door, telling every man still able to lift a gun to meet him at dawn. "The Dawson Gang will come back," he said. "We either stand, or we burn." At first, only a few answered. But by sunrise, nearly the whole town stood in the square: farmers, carpenters, even the preacher with his old rifle. Eli taught them how to take cover, how to aim, how to breathe. He spoke little, but his presence carried weight. Every order sounded like a vow he'd made to his own ghosts. And Clara watched. From her porch, she saw a man trying not to care, yet every move he made screamed of someone desperate to protect. She baked bread for the men, tended to bruises, and each evening left a plate by Eli's door. He never said thank you, but one morning she found a single wildflower tucked into the empty bowl. Weeks passed. The town began to believe again. The laughter of children returned to the streets. The saloon reopened, and for the first time in years, Ash Hollow felt alive. But Eli couldn't rest. Every night he sat by his window, polishing his gun, watching the horizon for dust. Sometimes, Clara would see the glow of his lantern and whisper a prayer for him before blowing out her own light. One night, after a long patrol, Eli found her waiting on her porch. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said softly. He tilted his hat, trying to hide the exhaustion in his eyes. "If I don't, no one will." "Thus." Her voice trembled. "And if it costs you your life?" He hesitated, then met her gaze. "Then maybe I'll have done one thing right." She stepped closer. The air between them felt charged, fragile, dangerous. "You already have," she whispered. Before he could answer, the sound of hooves thundered across the plains again. The Dawson Gang had returned. This time, they didn't sneak in under cover of night. They rode straight down Main Street at noon, yelling, firing into the air. The townsfolk scrambled for cover. Eli barked orders, his rifle flashing. The air filled with smoke, glass, and screams. Then came the explosion. The gang had set fire to the Finch cabin. Eli's heart stopped. He ran before anyone could stop him, coat flaring behind him as flames licked the roof. Inside, Clara clutched her son, coughing through the smoke. The heat seared her skin, the child crying for breath. "Clara!" Eli's voice broke through the roar. He smashed through the window, covering them with his coat. Beams cracked overhead, sparks burned his back. He lifted the boy first, then Clara, pushing them through the hole as the roof gave way. The building collapsed just as he dove out behind them. They hit the ground hard, Clara screaming his name. Blood dripped from his shoulder, but he was still breathing. Barely. She cradled his head in her lap, tears streaking through the soot. "Stay with me, Eli, please." He tried to speak, but his voice was only a rasp. "You and the boy are all that's left worth saving." When the gunfire faded, the Dawson Gang fled, but Ash Hollow lay in ashes once more. They carried Eli to the church, turned into a makeshift infirmary. For 2 days he drifted in and out, fever burning through him. Clara never left his side. She washed his wounds, held his hand when he trembled, whispered stories to keep him tethered to the world. On the 3rd night, the preacher told her gently, "If he doesn't wake by dawn," she cut him off. "He will." And he did. When Eli opened his eyes, Clara was asleep beside his bed, her son curled up near the fire. He stared at them, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: peace. But peace, in Ash Hollow, never lasted. A week later, a rider came with a letter sealed in black wax. It bore the mark of the Dawson Gang. Inside was a single sentence: "We're not done. Life." Eli's hand tightened around the paper. He knew the handwriting. It was his brother's. For the first time, the war he'd been running from had found him again. That night, Eli saddled his horse. Clara stepped into the doorway, the lamplight soft on her face. "You can't go alone," she said. "I have to," he replied. "This isn't about the town anymore. It's about ending something I should have stopped long ago." She stepped closer, voice trembling. "If you go now, you'll die." Zero. He looked at her, and for once, he didn't hide the truth. "Then at least it'll mean something." She grabbed his hand before he could turn away. "It already does." He wanted to stay. God, he wanted to. But the look in her eyes, the same look his wife once gave before the war took her, made him know he couldn't drag her into the fire again. He rode out into the storm, a lone figure against the horizon. Behind him, the church bell rang once, a sound that echoed like a farewell, and as he disappeared into the dark, Clara whispered to the night, "Come back to us, Eli. Please come back." The trail to the Dawson camp stretched across 40 miles of broken desert. By dawn, Eli Ward rode alone through a wasteland of red dust and silence. Every hoofbeat echoed like a heartbeat against the earth. He hadn't spoken his brother's name in 10 years. Not since the war, when they'd fought on opposite sides of the same battlefield, and one had never forgiven the other for surviving. Luke Dawson. The name was a wound that never closed. When Eli crested the ridge, he saw the camp below, a dozen men, half asleep around dying fires. And there, sitting by the largest tent, his brother, broad-shouldered, grizzled, eyes full of something too familiar, regret buried under pride. Eli dismounted, gun drawn. "It ends today, Luke." His brother didn't move. He poured 2 cups of coffee instead. "Then have a drink before you kill me." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind carried only the rattle of chains and distant thunder. Luke finally smiled, not kind, not cruel, just tired. "You always thought you could save the world, little brother. But some of us learned it doesn't want saving." Eli's jaw tightened. "You burned homes. You killed families." Luke's eyes hardened. "And you killed ours when you chose duty over blood." The words hit harder than bullets. The fire between them was no longer about right or wrong, it was about who had suffered more. They circled each other like wolves, guns low, hearts heavy. Eli said quietly, "The boy you were died with her, Luke, but you don't have to keep killing what's left of her memory." Luke's hand twitched toward his holster. "And you don't have to keep pretending you're any different from me." The silence cracked with a gunshot. Smoke curled. Luke staggered back, his gun clattered to the sand. Eli stood still, chest heaving, eyes burning with tears. "I didn't come here to kill you," he whispered. "You chose that." "No." Luke fell to his knees, blood soaking into the dust. "You always thought you could fix everything." He coughed, smiling faintly. "Tell Clara, you're not like me." When his brother's body hit the ground, the wind went still. The storm that had haunted Eli's life finally broke, but it didn't feel like peace. It felt like defeat. He buried Luke beneath a lone cottonwood tree, marking the grave with his brother's revolver. Then he knelt, whispering into the earth, "I'm sorry I couldn't save you." Rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavy, washing the blood from his hands. By nightfall, Eli was back in the saddle, heading toward the faint glow of Ash Hollow. Every step of his horse echoed like a heartbeat that refused to die. When he reached the outskirts, the town was in chaos again. The Dawson Gang, now leaderless, desperate, had launched a final assault before dawn. Smoke curled from rooftops, and the church bell tolled without stopping. Eli didn't wait. He charged straight into the gunfire, shouting for the townsfolk to take cover. Bullets tore through the air. He fired until the chambers clicked empty, then drew his brother's revolver and kept going. The last of the gang fled when the sun rose. The town stood silent, wounded but alive. Eli staggered through the smoke toward Clara's cabin, or what was left of it. She stood there, dirt on her face, arms wrapped around her son. When she saw him, she froze. He looked like a ghost, coat torn, face cut, blood streaking his neck, but his eyes were alive. "You came back," she breathed. He nodded weakly. "Told you I would." Then his knees gave out. Clara caught him before he hit the ground. She pressed her forehead to his, tears falling onto his dust-streaked cheek. "You don't get to die this time, Eli. Not after everything you've done." "Well." He smiled faintly. "Seems like I finally kept a promise." The doctor worked through the night. The bullet had grazed his ribs, and the fever raged again, but this time, Eli fought harder to stay alive. Clara stayed beside him, holding his hand as if sheer will could anchor him to the earth. "You said you came to protect the town," she whispered, voice breaking. "But you ended up saving me." Eli's lips trembled. Maybe it was the same thing all along. Note: outside, the first light of dawn touched the rooftops. The rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. When Eli finally slept, it was without nightmares. 3 days later, he woke to find Clara sitting by the window, sewing a torn shirt his. Her son played quietly near the fire, humming. Eli watched them in silence. Then he said softly, "You should leave this place. There's nothing left but ghosts." She turned, eyes steady. "Ghosts can rest. People can rebuild. But only if someone stays." He hesitated. "You mean me?" She smiled faintly. "You're the one who taught us how." He looked down at his hands, the same ones that had taken lives, now wrapped in clean bandages. The thought of staying terrified him more than dying ever had. But when Clara placed her hand over his, the weight of it felt like home. For the first time, he didn't pull away. By evening, the town gathered in the square. They lit lanterns, one for every soul lost to the Dawson Gang. The warm light danced against the dark, turning the scars of the past into flickers of hope. Eli stood beside Clara and her son, the boy gripping his hand. "Mama says you're a hero," the child whispered. Eli smiled faintly. "Your mama's wrong. I'm just a man who ran out of things to lose." The boy grinned. "Then you found us." Eli's throat tightened. He looked at Clara, her eyes shining in the lamplight, and for the first time, he didn't feel the urge to run. He took off his hat, placed it over his heart, and looked toward the fading horizon where his brother lay buried. "Rest now, Luke," he murmured. "It's over." But deep down, he knew it wasn't over. Not really. Because some promises don't end with death, they begin with it. Spring came late to Ash Hollow. The winter storms had stripped the land bare. But now the plains were turning green again, like the earth itself had decided to forgive. Eli Ward woke one morning to birdsong and sunlight slipping through the cracks in the shutters. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The scent of coffee, the soft hum of a woman's voice, and a child's laughter drew him back. Clara was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hair falling loose as she poured coffee into a tin cup. Her son sat at the table, drawing on a scrap of paper stick figures of a man, a woman, and a horse. Eli leaned in the doorway, silent. The sight hit him harder than any bullet. "You're supposed to be resting," Clara said, smiling without looking up. "I've done enough resting to last me a lifetime," he answered, voice soft. She turned then, meeting his eyes. They stood in quiet understanding, no grand declarations, just the steady truth of two people who'd already lost too much and still chose to stay. Outside, the town buzzed with the sounds of rebuilding. Hammers echoed, wagons rolled, laughter returned to the streets. Where the Finch cabin once stood, the townsfolk raised a new frame, stronger than before. The townspeople, once divided by fear, now worked shoulder to shoulder because one man had taught them what courage looked like. Eli helped rebuild the corral behind the church, his movements slow but sure. The boy followed him everywhere, imitating each gesture with a wooden hammer too big for his hands. "Sheriff Ward," the child called him proudly, and Eli never corrected him. At sunset, Eli rode out to the edge of town, to the small hill where the graves overlooked the valley. He carried a single wildflower, the kind that grew between the cracks of the burned soil. Kneeling, he placed it before the wooden cross marked simply, "Luke Dawson." He stayed there a long while, hat in his hands, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I did what I had to, brother," he said quietly. "But I'll keep what was good in you alive, I promise." When he rose, the sun was setting in a blaze of gold. The wind carried the scent of smoke and spring grass. Back in town, Clara was waiting on the porch, her son already asleep in her lap. The lantern beside her flickered warmly. She looked up as he approached, and for the first time in years, he smiled, not the half-smile of a man guarding his heart, but a real one. "You're late," she teased softly. "Had to say goodbye," he replied, voice low. "Then maybe it's time you said hello." He paused, then sat beside her. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that held peace instead of pain. Clara reached for his hand. He let her take it. Their fingers interlaced, scarred, rough, but steady. The boy stirred in his sleep, murmuring something about cowboys and angels. Clara brushed his hair aside and looked at Eli. "He misses his father," she said gently. Eli's gaze lingered on the child. Maybe he just needed someone to ride with him for a while. Clara smiled faintly. "And what about you, Eli Ward? Who rides with you?" He turned toward the lantern light, eyes softening. "Guess I just found out." Lie. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying laughter from the rebuilt saloon, the sound of music drifting under the stars. For the first time, Ash Hollow wasn't just surviving, it was alive. Eli leaned back, hat tilted over his eyes, the lantern glow dancing across his weathered face. The badge on his chest caught the light not as a symbol of authority, but of redemption. The story that began with fire ended in quiet light. And the man who swore to protect the town had finally learned that the truest kind of protection was love itself. Years passed, and the town of Ash Hollow changed. The streets once buried in dust now echoed with the sound of children chasing the wind. The saloon stood bright again, its doors open, its laughter real. Wheat grew tall in the fields, where graves once marked loss, and every spring the townsfolk placed wildflowers near the church fence for the ones who never came home. But some stories don't fade, even when the people in them grow old. They said that long ago, when the Dawson Gang ruled the plains, one man stood against them, a quiet, widowed sheriff named Eli Ward. He didn't just save the town, he taught it to live without fear. Old-timers still remembered the night he rode into fire for a woman and her son, how he bled for them, how he stayed when he could have ridden away. They whispered that he rebuilt not only the fences and houses, but the hearts of everyone who had forgotten what hope felt like. And if you ask the boy now grown, strong, and steady with a badge of his own, he'll tell you what his mother used to say. Eli Ward didn't protect Ash Hollow because it needed saving. He did it because we saved him first. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, travelers say they still see him, an older man in a worn hat, standing on the edge of town as the sun sets over the valley. The lantern light from the Finch porch still burns, and beside him stands a woman, her shawl fluttering in the wind. They never speak in these tales. They don't have to. Because the story has already been told in the laughter of a town reborn, in the peace after the gunfire, in the echo of a man's final promise kept. He came to protect the town. He ended up protecting her. And in doing so, he found something neither fire nor grief could ever take again: a home. He promised to protect the town, but ended up protecting her. A tale of redemption, courage, and love reborn under the western sky. If you believe in second chances, tap that like button. Subscribe to the Western Trail, where every story rides toward hope. And share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear your heart.